Today I'd like to discuss the topic of chesed, of loving kindness, but I'd like to take a certain avenue, a certain approach, which I think is intrinsic and a basic to all aspects of kindness, which we're supposed to perform inside, between ourselves, in our family, and certainly within the community. I'd like to begin with an incident that occurred to myself and my daughter. She was going to a school in Jerusalem, and one of her friends' father had died. He was a great scholar, a Rav of a community, and I knew him well. His name was actually Reb Mordechai Shakovitsky. He lived in Malot Daphna. He was the Rav of Alzei Abira in Jerusalem. And I felt I had to go to the funeral of a great man, and my daughter was going along as well, but I couldn't stay. And I said to my daughter that I'll meet her outside. I don't know if you know the area, but Shmuel Hanovi, the street outside Alzei, I'll meet you there in a half an hour, but I can't stay more. I have to go back. I had a share that evening, so we arranged to meet. Now, if you know, Alzei Abira, the area, is built on a circle, and the men were standing on one side of the circle, and round the corner on the other side were the women. And I finished a half an hour, and I came out, and my daughter hadn't come. I went around to see if I could find her. And I walked around the other side of the buildings, and I was astonished what I saw. There must have been close to 300 or 400 women, and all of them were swaying. It was during the orations, the funeral orations, the Hespedim, and they were all, with their eyes closed, swaying in motion. And I looked, and I saw, and I was overwhelmed by the involvement of all of these women. They weren't family, they were ladies of the community, but they all were involved with what was happening. And that's an aspect, I think, of kindness which struck me so much there. The feeling of that I'm part of this funeral, even though, of course, they weren't family. I remember the similar incident occurred. I've lived over 35 years in Jerusalem, and I'd like to just share, because I think there is this common theme of aspects of loving kindness, but the involvement in the kindness, which I'd like to bring out. We were blessed once with one of our children, one of our boys who was born, and the custom is on Friday night, you make what's called a shalom zocha. People come round and have albus and a drink of wine, and they say l'chaim. And my wife had sent me on a shopping spree to buy the cakes for the evening, for Friday night. I went into the store on Rehov Meir Sharim, it's called Briesel's, and I said to the lady behind the counter, we had a child. She said, "Oh, Mazel Tov, how nice, very good." And I said, "My wife has given me a list." So she said, "Oh, let me hear what you have to buy." So I said, "I'd like this sort of cake." She said, No, don't buy that sort of cake. So I said, "Well, my wife said I should buy it." Then I said, she asked me to buy these sort of cookies. No, don't buy these cookies. And nearly everything which I had on my list, the lady behind the counter said, no, it's not worth buying. So I got a little bit frustrated, and I said to her, "1 minute. Madam, who is making this simcha?" So she turned around spontaneously and she said, "We are." What a beautiful response. I smiled at her and I did whatever she told me. It wasn't my simcha, it was our simcha. There's the involvement. On a small aspect, but it matters so much. It makes all the difference Another occasion had happened that there was a lady, an elderly lady. She was in her mid-50s. She hadn't been married, and we managed to find her a chosen, and she was getting married. And my wife and I, who I think at the time we were younger than the Kala, but we were like the father and the mother who were taking her to the chuppah. And I was looking after the chosen, but the Kala was actually lived in our house and came to our house for many, many times, on many occasions. So when it came to the chuppah, I took the chosen over, as you know, to cover over the Kala. It's called the bedecken of the Kala. You cover over the Kala with a veil. And I walked over. I never usually walk over to the women's side, but this time, since I was with the chosen, I walked over with him. And as I walked into the side where the women are, all the women were jumping up around this 55-year-old Kala, the bride, and wishing her mazel tov and kissing her and dancing and taking pictures and saying, "Come on now, smile this way and that way." And they were all involved. There's the point. The level of involvement is the degree of kindness. A friend of mine once was davening in a shul on Shabbos morning in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And as the davening was proceeding, the first davening, the shachris, until learning, a buzz, he told me, went around the shul that there was a chosen in the shul who was getting married, but no one knew who he was. And there were no family members, but he was getting married that week, and he was with a friend. And the friend had asked the gabbai, the person who gives out the aliyahs at the Sefer Torah, if his friend could have an aliyah because he's getting married this week. No one knew who he was. No one had any connection with him. It came to the time he had an aliyah, and everybody sang Mazel Tov, and from nowhere, I don't know where, but when he had his aliyah, he was called to the Torah. There were candies available for throwing on the chosen, and after davening, he said he turned around and he was astonished. A whole kiddush had been laid out for the chosen. It was, they called it the ofruf, the Shabbos before his chuppah. And from nowhere, the whole kiddush had been laid out in order to honor and to mesameach, to enjoy and to let the chosen know the simcha which was involved here by them. It's the level of involvement. And all these have the same common thread, the idea that the connection which people make, the idea that they're involved with a person and not just the kind face or the smile, or you hand out the money and basically leave me alone. It's much more than that. The real level of kindness is the level of involvement. Where do we learn this from? Perhaps there's a source in the Torah which I'd like to bring down. We are told in the Torah that Noach was a tzaddik, Noah, from the beginning of time. He was an outstanding righteous man. He was unique in his generation. I remember with my children, they used to have a song which Uncle Moshe used to sing, and they say, Noach was a good man, a good man, a good man. Everyone around was wicked, but they were. He was unique. Now, when it came to saving Noah, we learn in the Torah that he was required to build an ark and collect all the animals and look after them for a whole year. And this was going to be his salvation. The question we can ask, though, if Noah was such a righteous person, and if he had such remarkable credentials, is there no other way that the Almighty could have saved him than being a zookeeper for 24 hours, 7 days a week, 24/7? But if he was so righteous, couldn't the Almighty have found a deck chair on top of a mountain with a bottle of Coca-Cola and saved him that way? Why was it necessary that he should serve in such a menial way without any moment's relaxation of any sort? The Medrash, the commentators bring out that one of the sons of Noah, whose name was Shem, met Eliezer, who was the servant of Abraham. And Eliezer asked Shem, tell me, what was it like inside the ark? And Shem said it was basically, as I just said, 24/7. No relaxation, no sleep, no break, looking after the animals. It was like penal service in Siberia, but tenfold. But why? Why such enormous tasks and such difficult responsibilities of feeding the animals and cleaning them and looking after them if he was such a righteous man? The answer lies perhaps in the Gemara Kiddushin. The Talmud explains that Rabbi Gamliel, who was at the time a prince, the Nasi in Israel, made a wedding banquet for his son who was getting married. And sitting at the table amongst the honored guests were three great Tanoim, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Tzadok, were sitting there at the meal. Rabbi Gamliel, who was the host, walked round, says the Gemara, with a bottle of wine. And he went over to Rabbi Yoshua with a bottle of wine to serve him. And Rabbi Yoshua took the drink, and he was very pleased with him. Rabbi Eliezer, who was sitting there at the side, turned round and said, Yoshua, how can you allow that? How can you allow such a distinguished person as the Nasi, as Rabbi Gamliel, the prince, to serve you? Have you no inhibitions? Surely a waiter, but not the great man to serve you. And Rabbi Yoshua turned around and says, well, I can think of somebody even greater than Rabbi Gamliel. After all, Abraham, as we know, sat at the gate and served the three Arabs, and they were angels, but in reality they appeared to him as if they were three Arabs, and he served them. If Abraham could serve the three Arabs, then why can't Rabbi Gamliel serve me? And Rabbi Tzadok, who was sitting at the side, on the sidelines, turned around and said, I can think of somebody much more important than Abraham. We learn that the Almighty, Mashiv Ha'uach Umayrid Hageshem, brings down the rain and brings the wind and serves us all every day. Hu Naisein Lechem L'chol Basar. He gives food to all. Poiseach Es Yodecha. He's like the waiter. So if the Almighty can be the waiter, then why can't Rabbi Gamliel? What's the answer? The answer to the question is that the level of involvement is a privilege. It's not just the smile and the check which is written out, perhaps, of the kindness. It goes much further than that. It's the degree of involvement which we see by Noach, which we see by allowing Rabbi Gamliel to serve his guests. That is the true level of loving kindness, how much involvement a person has. And it's a privilege to serve. It's a great honor to be involved with others. If you look carefully, perhaps, maybe that's what we refer to when we talk about the Almighty, as which we say in benching, when we grace after meals, Hu hativ, Hu mativ, Hu yativ lanu. He continually provides. He continually gives. And therefore, the commentators explain that if you remember the incident of building the tabernacle inside the wilderness, the first criteria in building the tabernacle was something called Nadivus Lev, a generous heart. And the commentators, the rabbis, explain, what does it mean by a generous heart? Why was this the first criteria? Meaning the wood and the gold and the silver and the metal and the skins and whatever was needed in order to build the tabernacle. It was all the raw materials, they had to be given in a certain way. They had to be given with this great generosity, but this involvement in generosity. Now, why? One of the great sages, the great mentor, the Alter from Kelm, Reb Simcha Zissel Broider, explained in the following way. The laws of an architect are, it's not what he wants to build, but who's going to live in that house. You ask the tenant what he wants, and then the architect designs and builds the building according to the specifications of the person who's going to live there. Says the Alter, who's going to live in this house? The Almighty. He is intrinsically only a giver. Olam chesed yiboneh. He built a world of kindness. But his level of kindness is the involvement. He looks after us. He secures us. He feeds us. He gives us whatever we need. The involvement that he provides, we as the builders of the tabernacle also have to have that criteria. And therefore, all the building specifications had to be done in a way of great nedivus leiv, of great generosity. And without that, the resident, the Almighty, would never have been happy to live there. Therefore, we see that really this criteria begins initially with the Almighty. Maybe that's the reason why we address him when we pray, Goimel chasodim tovim. He provides great kindnesses. That's his attribute, and that's what we follow on with. But it's more than just the line of giving. It's more. It's the involvement. It's the feeling of who you're giving to, and the care and the indulgence in the way the kindness is done. I'd like to bring two examples, and they really are the background of the profile of perhaps of these great people. The first, as we mentioned just before, is Abraham. One scene comes to mind which really illuminates in the most beautiful way what does it mean, the real trait of kindness, of loving kindness. 3 days after his bris milah, his circumcision, this old man of 100 was sitting on one of the hottest days, or the hottest days in world history. The Almighty made it blisteringly hot so that no one would trouble Abraham and he wouldn't have to entertain any guests. But he wasn't happy. He sat at the door of his house and he peered and glanced and looked for guests, and then he saw 3 Arabs on the horizon. And the commentators say, Vayar, Vayorotz. He saw, and he made a flying leap. He ran from the chair. Remember, Rav Brevda, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, once made this beautiful point. He flew from his seat and entertained them. He said, I'll give you a little bit of bread and water, but he really made a banquet. And he stood over them, and he watched over them. V'hu oimed aleihim. He watched and saw whatever they needed. The man was involved with his kindness. It was much more than just a giver, not just offering a cup of coffee. He was involved. He watched. He told them to wash their feet. He told them to look after themselves, to rest under the shade. And then he provided the meal with the help of Sarah, who catered for their needs. The involvement. Take another example, perhaps the greatest of all, was Moses, when he was a young boy and living in the palace in Egypt. He left the palace every day and walked the streets of Cairo and walked around where all the Jews were working. And says the Medrash, the commentators, V'hu boicha, he cried. He was broken. He couldn't take it. Says the verse in the Torah, Nosan einov v'liboy liyos meitzar aleihem, says Rashi. He gave his heart and he gave his eyes and he saw what they were going through. Say the commentators, he saw, he didn't just see. Nosan einov means he understood their plight. The Nosan liboy, he gave his heart. He felt for them. That's called involvement. And he switched bundles and baggages and loads from an old man to a young man. And he made sure, as much as he possibly could, to help the people. He became involved with the people. His kindness went much, much further, was just maybe lending a helping hand. He felt for them. The Medrash, the commentators, explain that this and only this was the reason why Moses became the leader of the people. Nowhere do we ever find that he was the greatest scholar, he was the greatest sage, he was the greatest legal authority. We never learn about that. All we learn about Moses was that he cared, and he cared in a great way. When he arrived, if you remember, at the well in Midian, he helped the daughters of Jethro, of Yisro, to find water. He cared. He was involved with people. That was the trait which both Abraham and Moses had. Maybe if we can add just one final point. In other words, we're saying that behind the profile of these great people like Abraham, Moses, and let's just have a look at King David, when he was on the run from King Saul, who was trying to kill him. I think it was about the 6th or 7th stop. He went to a place called the Caves of Adullam, which is by the Dead Sea. And there we're told in the prophets that, in the book of Samuel, that he gathered together 400, in the words in Hebrew are Metzuke Lev, broken people. No money, no happiness, no family, heavily in debt, no friendship, 400 of them, when he was on the run as a fugitive from King Saul, and he cared for them. He was like a father figure to all of them when he himself was in such great danger. He was involved with them. This is the trait of loving kindness, but behind it is the level of involvement. I'd like to end with an episode of perhaps one of the greatest Torah sages in our generation or the previous generation, who was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, the father of the Brisker Rov. He was called Reb Chaim Brisker. He was renowned throughout Europe, throughout the world, as an enormous sage of great authority and of great Torah learning. He was traveling once on a train to Warsaw. And sitting on the train, he was sitting across from a young student from a yeshiva, from a Talmudic academy, and he was talking to him, and Reb Chaim turned around and said to the student on the way, and where are you going? So he said, I'm going to Warsaw. So he said, oh, and why are you going there? Said Reb Chaim. Said the student, well, Rebbe, I am one of the unfortunate ones. I've been called up for the Polish army. Now, in those times, the army in Poland was something you avoided at all costs. It was 25 years service, and most people who went into the army lost all traces of Judaism. It was almost impossible, certainly, to keep Shabbos or to eat kosher, and it wasn't possible. So what happened is you would bribe the authorities. You had no choice. Otherwise, you would basically lose your life and lose all your Judaism. So they gave money to the authorities in order to get an exemption. Reb Chaim said, and who are you giving the money to? Said the yeshiva bacher to Reb Chaim, oh, there's someone in Warsaw, he's very well known. He has, as they say, pull with the authorities, and Reb Chaim says, I don't know him. I'd never heard of him. Said the yeshiva, oh, no, Rabbi, he's very, very well known. He's renowned. Reb Chaim said, I hope it works out well for you, but almost prophetically, Reb Chaim said, let me just let you know that if you need me for any reason whatsoever, I'm in this and this shul, this synagogue. You can come and find me if you need my help. And by then the train arrived in Warsaw. There were hundreds of people who had come to collect and meet the great Rav, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. And the yeshiva bacher went his way with a lot of money in his pocket. As I said, it was almost prophetic. He gave him the money, and the man disappeared. And the yeshiva bacher was in enormous stress. He was panic-stricken. What do I do? The man had taken the money and run. He remembered the address. He went and found Reb Chaim. And there were hundreds of people outside. It was a major convention of rabbis in a shul, and all the rabbis were inside, and people were desperate to see and the great sages who had arrived at this shul. He went over to the guard on the door and said, I've come to see Reb Chaim. Said the man on the door, the security man, I'm sorry, you may as well go home. You're not going to be able to see him. No, he said, really, Reb Chaim had told me. And the guard refused him and let him get in. He made a commotion. And the commotion was so loud and so disturbing, Reb Chaim went to the door and saw the bacher, remembered and recognized him, and said to the guard, no, that's fine. Let him come in. Sitting at the table, around the table, were 30 of the great sages, the great halachic codifiers within Europe, sitting around the table. Within about 5 seconds, Reb Chaim realized what had happened. He turned around and banged on the table and said to the great rabbis who were there to discuss very important matters regarding the Jewish nation, gentlemen, he said to them, this yeshiva bocher here is in trouble. He explained about that he'd given money over and he'd lost his money, and now he needed other money in order to find his exemption and to give it to the authorities and bribe the authorities. Otherwise, he's finished for life in the Polish army, 25 years. Said Reb Chaim, I'm going to give money, and he put his money on the table. I'd like all of you to give money as well, or promissory notes, whatever, and we must get money to save this yeshiva bocher. Within about 15 minutes, Reb Chaim had gathered all the money together. He then turned around to the bocher in front of the rabbis and said, now listen, go to this and this person and nobody else and tell him that I sent you, and he will look after you as far as your exemption goes. But don't go to anybody else. The bocher left, overjoyed, and then one of the rabbis sitting around the table turned around and said to Reb Chaim, Rabbi, I have a question. We have come today from all over Europe to discuss the Jewish people living in Palestine, in Israel at the time, and all the needs and the concerns of the Jewish community. One particular yeshiva bocher can wait until the end of the day. It was as if Reb Chaim had been electrocuted. He jumped up, crying, and he turned around and answered the man as follows in front of all the rabbis. I don't understand you. This one yeshiva bocher is all of the Jewish nation. Everyone counts. Each person is fundamental. We're not dealing with numbers, we're dealing with individuals. Each individual is the whole of Klal Yisrael. And with that, he sat down. What a beautiful lesson of kindness, of how far it goes. Everybody counts. No one is excluded. Each individual is part of our involvement as a Jew, one with another. To love your neighbor as yourself. The cardinal words are v'yohavta, the av of the love, the involvement. One cares for a child, one cares for a family member, but it should stretch out to all members in Klal Yisrael. No exclusions. No one is left out. The theme of loving kindness involves everybody. It's perhaps one of the most important points in the profile of Abraham, of Moses, of King David. And certainly it's an attribute that we recognize the Almighty by, hu hetiv lanu. He continually gives in a most beautiful way. From my own personal experiences, that's what I have found as the trait of kindness in Jerusalem. From the funeral I went to, the weddings, or buying cookies for my child's Shalom Zachor on Friday night. That's, I think, one of the most important points of Chesed, the level of involvement, the degree of caring, and the recognition that every single person counts. Perhaps if we can pick up these qualities and apply them, we are following in the ways of the Almighty. That's the way He wanted His tabernacle built, and that's the way it was built for Him. Maybe if we could follow in that way, then certainly we would be similar to Him and follow in the true example, the profile of the Tselem Elokim, the image of the Almighty in the world. Thank you.